My name is Logan Pierce. I'm 32 years old, and I co-founded an AI logistics startup in Columbus, Ohio. 3 weeks ago, while I was sitting in a glass conference room preparing to pitch the biggest client of my career, my family made it clear what I was to them without saying a word out loud. My phone lit up once. A message in our family group chat. "Relax, Logan. Your money is helping all of us enjoy Tampa Beach. Thanks for the contribution." There was a photo attached. My parents, my younger brother, champagne flutes catching sunlight on a yacht deck, the blue glare of Florida water. No hesitation, no apology. I remember the hum of the air conditioner, the cold edge of the table under my palms, the way the room stayed quiet while something inside me went very still. They didn't steal quietly. They wanted me to see it. What came next put my finances and my future at risk. Lawyers would get involved. Accounts would be frozen, and a truth about my family would surface that couldn't be undone. If this already feels familiar, stay with me. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if stories like this matter to you, a gentle like or subscribe helps more than you think. Now let me take you back to where this really began. 3 months before the message from Tampa appeared on my phone, there were signs I chose not to give names to. It started quietly. A few withdrawals that felt out of rhythm. Not alarming on their own. Just enough to notice if you were looking closely, which I wasn't, not really. I told myself it was timing. Overlapping bills. The ordinary friction of shared finances. I had learned to smooth those things over without stopping to examine them. By then, I had already transferred more than $60,000 to cover the mortgage on my parents' house. The transfers were monthly automatic clean. I treated them the same way I treated infrastructure costs at work, necessary and visible, not worth lingering on. The house no longer felt like mine when I visited, but I didn't connect that feeling to money. I thought distance was just part of adulthood. When I finally asked my father about the inconsistencies, he answered the way he always had, calm, composed, faintly amused. "Unexpected expenses," he said. "You're doing well. This isn't a big deal for you. Nothing for you." The phrase did its work quietly. It shrank the numbers. It made my hesitation feel petty. I let that happen. I always had. Then one evening, alone in the office, after everyone else had gone home, I saw a charge that didn't belong to any explanation I'd rehearsed. $7,800, travel agency, Tampa. I didn't panic. I didn't call anyone. I just stared at the screen longer than necessary, watching the reflection of my own face hover faintly over the numbers. The building was silent, except for the low hum of servers and the air system cycling on and off. It felt like a moment waiting to be acknowledged. When I asked my mother about it, she didn't deny the charge. She didn't justify it either. "Don't be so controlling," she said. "Money isn't everything." The line landed cleanly, not as an answer, but as a dismissal. And I accepted it as one. I told myself families don't itemize trust, that love doesn't come with spreadsheets, that asking too many questions was a sign of distance, not responsibility. I convinced myself that backing off was the mature thing to do. So I stopped pressing. I stopped asking follow-up questions. I stopped sitting with the discomfort long enough for it to form into something solid. The withdrawals continued. The balances dipped and corrected themselves. I focused on work on growth curves, hiring plans, the language of momentum. Being useful was familiar territory. Being necessary felt safer than being curious. There's a quiet reward that comes with being the reliable one. It looks like purpose. It sounds like gratitude. And it can mask a lot of imbalance if you let it. What unsettles me now isn't how much money moved through those accounts. It's how little effort went into explaining it. The answers were short. The tone unbothered, almost impatient, as if my understanding wasn't required, as if my role was simply to keep things running. I remember thinking more than once that if something were truly wrong, someone would tell me. That silence meant stability, that my job was to maintain flow, not interrupt it with questions that made people uncomfortable. That wasn't a single decision. It was a habit I'd built over years. Staying agreeable, staying functional, staying just useful enough not to be examined too closely. The night before everything came into focus, I skimmed my statements again. Not carefully, not like evidence. Just enough to reassure myself that I was overreacting. I closed the laptop and went to sleep, believing I had chosen peace. The next morning, my phone buzzed in a glass conference room. And suddenly the numbers had context. Faces, locations, a yacht deck catching Florida sunlight. In that moment, it became clear the real question had never been whether the expenses made sense. It was whether I was allowed to notice them at all. That realization didn't arrive with anger. It came quietly, like a shift in weight you only feel once you've already started falling. I had mistaken access for trust, and silence for safety. The truth didn't come from my parents, or my brother, or any sudden confession meant to clear the air. It came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Her name appeared on my phone late one evening, an unfamiliar area code lighting up the screen while I was still sitting at my desk. I almost let it go to voicemail. The day had already been long, and I wasn't in the habit of answering calls I didn't recognize. When I did pick up, her voice was low, cautious, as if she were checking first to see whether this was a safe conversation to have. I wasn't sure if I should call, she said. But I thought you should know. Your mom's been telling people that you paid for the whole Tampa trip. She didn't sound accusatory. Just careful, like someone handing over something fragile. I didn't respond right away. I thanked her, said I appreciated the call, and hung up. The office around me had gone quiet again. Evening light pressed against the windows, turning the glass into mirrors. I sat there longer than necessary, letting the words settle without trying to argue with them. Your mom's been telling people, not asking, not explaining, telling. I opened my email next. Old threads, family updates. Logistics I'd stopped reading closely because nothing ever seemed to change. Then the group chat I'd muted months ago, scrolling back further than I had in a long time. That's where I saw it. A message from my brother Dylan. Casual, unremarkable in tone, almost bored. He's always busy anyway. The money's just sitting there. Might as well use it. There were no laughing emojis, no sarcasm. Just a statement of fact. I read it once, then again, then a third time slower. What struck me wasn't the entitlement. That had been there for years, just expressed in smaller ways. What unsettled me was the certainty, the assumption that my absence from the conversation meant permission, that my silence translated cleanly into consent. I didn't feel angry. Not yet. There was no spike of adrenaline, no urge to call anyone and demand explanations. What I felt instead was something flatter, heavier, like a door closing somewhere I hadn't realized was still open. I sat there for hours without moving. The office lights shut off automatically around me, leaving only my screen glowing in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't pace. I didn't rehearse speeches in my head. I just let the pattern come into focus. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't poor communication. It wasn't even secrecy. It was expectation. They expected the money to be there. They expected me not to interfere. They expected my role to remain unchanged, quiet, dependable, peripheral. I thought back to all the times I'd stepped in without being asked. Paid a bill, smoothed something over, made sure a problem disappeared before it could inconvenience anyone else. I had told myself I was being supportive, generous, mature. What I hadn't considered was how consistency can turn into entitlement when no one ever pushes back. The realization didn't hurt all at once. It arrived in pieces. A look exchanged at dinner. A comment about how lucky I was to be doing so well. The way financial conversations stopped the moment I entered the room, as if my presence made them unnecessary. They weren't hiding things from me. They were operating without me. I closed the chat and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling until my eyes stopped focusing. Somewhere in the building, a janitor's cart rolled past, wheels squeaking faintly against the floor. Life continuing, indifferent. What I understood then finally was that my silence hadn't been neutral. It had been useful. It allowed everything to keep moving exactly as it was, and they had grown comfortable with that. There was a strange clarity in recognizing it. Not relief, not resolve. Just clarity. The kind that strips away excuses and leaves you alone with the shape of things as they actually are. I didn't confront anyone that night. I didn't send screenshots or ask for explanations I already knew wouldn't come. I did one thing instead. I stopped assuming this would resolve itself. And in that quiet decision, something shifted, not in them, but in me. I didn't confront anyone after that night. I didn't ask for explanations or demand apologies that would only circle back into denial. I understood finally that clarity didn't require their participation. The next morning, I opened a new account at a different bank. It was an ordinary branch tucked between a pharmacy and a dry cleaner. Fluorescent lights, beige counters, a place designed to disappear into routine. I sat across from a banker who asked standard questions and slid forms toward me with practiced neutrality. I signed where I was told to sign, initialed where I was told to initial. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't mention family. I just redirected the flow. That small administrative act felt heavier than it should have. Not because it was complicated, but because it was deliberate. It marked the first time I had chosen separation without explaining myself. Later that day, I called a lawyer. She specialized in financial abuse within families' cases that never start with shouting, never look dramatic from the outside. Her voice was calm, almost clinical, as she asked me to describe what had been happening. Dates, amounts, access, assumptions. I answered carefully, resisting the urge to editorialize. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "You weren't betrayed," she said. "You were being exploited." The word landed without flourish. No sympathy, no outrage, just accuracy. She explained the difference between shared accounts and consent, between access and authorization, between trust and expectation. I took notes even though I didn't need to. Writing things down helped me keep my distance from what they meant. That night, I began collecting everything. Bank statements, transaction histories, screenshots of messages I'd once dismissed as casual, emails with dates and timestamps that lined up too neatly to ignore. I labeled folders the way I labeled project files at work: clear, neutral, unemotional. Evidence doesn't require anger. It requires patience. Each evening after work, I sat at my desk and added to the archive. I didn't rush. I didn't skim. I checked numbers twice, cross-referenced dates, matched charges to travel itineraries I hadn't been meant to see, yacht bookings, resort reservations, rental cars with premium upgrades. What struck me was how methodical it all was. Not reckless, not impulsive, planned, repeated, comfortable. There were moments when emotion threatened to break through, when a familiar phrase in my mother's voice echoed in my head or my brother's certainty replayed itself. Each time I stopped. I reminded myself that reaction was not the goal. Don't let your feelings destroy your proof, the lawyer had said. So I didn't. I stopped answering calls that didn't come with context. I responded to messages with fewer words. I redirected income streams quietly without announcement. The distance wasn't punitive. It was procedural. At night, when the apartment went quiet, I lay awake longer than usual. Not replaying arguments, but asking myself questions I'd avoided for years. When had helping turned into obligation? When had generosity become invisible? How long had my silence been mistaken for agreement? The answers weren't flattering. They didn't cast me as a hero or a victim. They revealed a pattern I had helped maintain because it felt easier than disruption. I wasn't preparing for revenge. I was preparing for accuracy. By the end of the week, the picture was complete enough to stand on its own. The numbers told a story without adjectives. A story that didn't require raised voices or dramatic confrontations to be understood. I didn't feel empowered. I felt focused. And somewhere in that focus, the fear that had kept me compliant for so long began to loosen. Not because the situation was resolved, it wasn't. But because, for the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. Silence had been my habit. Now it was my tool. The call from my father came 3 days later. It wasn't urgent in tone. No greeting weighed down by concern. Just the familiar confidence of someone who expected compliance before the request was even finished. "We need another $3,000, he said. "There's an issue with the house." He didn't explain what kind of issue. He never did. The details had always been optional, a courtesy extended only if I pushed, and I had learned not to. I was standing in my kitchen phone pressed to my ear, watching the digital clock above the microwave tick forward 1 second at a time. The room smelled faintly of coffee I'd forgotten to finish. Everything felt ordinary, which made the moment harder to recognize as what it was. For the first time, I didn't agree. "I'll need a detailed statement," I said. "Itemized, dates, receipts." There was a pause on the line. Not long, just long enough to register as unfamiliar. What he said sharp now. "Why would you need that?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify myself. "I just need to see where the money's going." The silence stretched. Then a short laugh. Dismissive. "You're overthinking this," he said. "We don't have time for paperwork." But I had already decided this conversation wasn't about persuasion. After we hung up, I waited exactly 20 minutes. I called my bank and reported suspicious activity. I used the language the lawyer had suggested: neutral, factual, precise. No accusations, no family context, just patterns that didn't align with authorization. The representative listened, asked a few clarifying questions, and then put me on hold. The hold music was soft looping, designed to calm. I stared out the window while it played, watching traffic move through the intersection below. People going somewhere. People assuming the systems around them worked the way they were meant to. When the representative came back on the line, her voice had changed slightly, more careful. "We're going to freeze the card temporarily," she said, "while we review." I thanked her, hung up, and waited. The fallout didn't take long. My phone rang again, this time with urgency. Then again. Messages followed, stacking up without pause. Missed calls, voicemails left mid-sentence. The first one I listened to came through distorted with background noise. They were at the Tampa airport. My father's voice broke through louder than I'd ever heard it. "What did you do?" he shouted. "We're stuck. The card isn't working." I leaned against the counter and listened without interrupting. "You can't do this," he went on. "This is irresponsible. You're embarrassing us." Behind his anger, I could hear movement. Voices. The hollow echo of a terminal. A place built entirely around departure. I didn't do anything I said when he finally stopped. I'm protecting my account. There was a sharp intake of breath, then fury. Accusations followed selfishness, betrayal, ingratitude. Words meant to pull me back into a familiar position, the one where I apologized, the one where I fixed things. I didn't argue. I didn't explain the freeze or the review or the evidence already compiled. None of that would have mattered in that moment. I'll follow up once the bank finishes looking into it, I said. That's all I can do. I hung up before he could respond. My hands were steady when I set the phone down. That surprised me. I'd expected shaking, a rush of guilt, something to signal I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Instead, there was a quiet clarity. For the first time, their inconvenience wasn't mine to resolve. The rest of the day passed slowly. Messages continued to come in. From my mother this time, then my brother. Different tones, same pressure, appeals to family, to loyalty, to urgency. I didn't respond. That evening, I sat alone on the couch and replayed the day in my head. Not the shouting, but the pause after I asked for documentation. The moment when expectation met resistance and didn't know what to do with it. I realized then that this was the first consequence they'd experienced. Not a confrontation, not a lecture, just the absence of access. And in that absence, something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer speaking to me as a given. They were speaking to me as an obstacle. The messages changed tone after that. At first, they were sharp and immediate demands, wrapped in outrage questions, framed like accusations. When those didn't get a response, something else took their place. My brother went first. "You really did this," he wrote, "after everything they've done for you." The wording was familiar. It carried the assumption that there was a shared ledger I had somehow failed to honor, that whatever imbalance existed could only run in one direction. Then my mother. Her messages were longer, carefully constructed. She didn't mention the airport, or the card, or Tampa. She talked instead about family, about how hurt everyone was, about how money had never mattered to them the way it seemed to matter to me now. "Do you really think money is more important than us?" she asked. I read the question more than once. Not because it was difficult to understand, but because it was designed to make understanding irrelevant. It collapsed everything into a single moral test and placed me on the wrong side of it by default. I didn't respond. That silence felt different this time. Not passive, not accidental. It was intentional, and I could feel the strain it created on the other end. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, everything. Screenshots, voicemails, missed calls, the sudden escalation after the freeze. She didn't comment on the emotional content. She didn't need to. The patterns spoke clearly enough. "Let them talk," she said. "You don't need to correct the narrative right now." Outside of my family, the story didn't stay contained for long. A colleague noticed I was distracted during a meeting and asked if everything was okay. I gave a careful answer. Nothing detailed. Just enough to explain the weight without inviting opinion. He listened, nodded, then told someone else. By the end of the week, it had made its way through our local startup circle. Not as gossip exactly, more like recognition. People had seen versions of this before: quiet success paired with invisible obligation. Support given until it became expected. No one treated me like a villain. That surprised me more than it should have. A few people reached out privately, shared stories they hadn't named before, parents who had taken out loans in their names, siblings who assumed access meant ownership. The details were different, but the structure was the same. What shifted wasn't public sympathy. It was the frame. For the first time, the situation wasn't being interpreted as a family disagreement or a personality flaw. It was being seen as what it was: financial exploitation built on familiarity. At home, the messages kept coming. My brother accused me of humiliating them, of making things public, of choosing reputation over blood. Each word tried to reposition me as the aggressor. Each sentence assumed I would step in to soothe the discomfort I'd caused. I didn't. I noticed how quickly their language moved from entitlement to injury, how access once removed became grievance. They weren't asking for understanding. They were demanding restoration. That distinction mattered. At night, I sat with the quiet and let it settle. I didn't distract myself with work or noise. I paid attention to what the silence revealed. I wasn't anxious. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't even angry. What I felt was distance. A clean, measurable distance that made it easier to see how much emotional labor I had been doing without recognizing it as labor. How often I had absorbed tension so others wouldn't have to sit with it. Now they were sitting with it. The lawyer checked in again at the end of the week. The bank's review was progressing. The evidence was solid. The next step would involve formal action. "Are you ready for that?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was unsure, but because I was aware of what readiness actually meant. It didn't mean wanting conflict. It meant accepting that clarity has consequences. "Yes," I said finally. After we hung up, I looked around my apartment. Nothing dramatic had changed. Same furniture, same view, same routines. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer reacting to pressure. I was letting it reveal itself. The hearing at Franklin County came sooner than I expected. Not because the process moved quickly, but because time had started to feel different once everything was in motion. Days no longer blurred together. Each one carried weight, purpose, a direction I hadn't felt in years. The courthouse was quiet in the way official buildings always are. High ceilings muted footsteps, conversations lowered out of habit rather than respect. I arrived early, a thin folder under my arm that only hinted at what it contained. The real weight was elsewhere, settled somewhere behind my ribs. My parents arrived together. They didn't look at me. My brother came a few minutes later, eyes sharp, jaw set, already rehearsing whatever version of events he thought would land best. None of them spoke to me. There were no last-minute appeals, no whispered explanations meant to soften the room. That more than anything told me how they expected this to go. We took our seats. The judge entered. The formality of it all pressed down, steady and impersonal. No one was there to take sides. No one cared about our history or how long we'd played our roles. The law only cared about facts. My lawyer spoke first. Her voice was calm even. She didn't dramatize the situation or paint anyone as a villain. She laid out a sequence of transactions, dates, amounts, access patterns. She used phrases like unauthorized use and assumption of consent, language that stripped the story of emotion and left only structure. "This is not a shared family account," she said. "This is repeated financial abuse under the appearance of trust." My father shifted in his seat. When their attorney responded, the argument leaned heavily on familiarity, on precedent within the family, on how things had always been done. He spoke as if history itself were authorization, as if long-standing behavior carried its own legitimacy. The judge listened without expression, Then the evidence was entered. Transaction records aligned with travel bookings. Charges for yacht rentals matched dates and locations. Resort reservations overlapped precisely with the frozen card incident at the Tampa airport. Rental car upgrades. Champagne packages. The details were exact, indifferent. At one point, my brother interrupted. "That's not what happened," he said, leaning forward. He knew. He didn't say anything. The judge raised a hand. "You'll speak when addressed," he said. "Sit down." The room went still. I didn't testify much. There wasn't a need. When I was asked to confirm account ownership and authorization limits, I did. When I was asked whether I had approved those charges, I didn't hesitate. No. It felt strange answering with such finality. Not because I was unsure, but because I had spent so long softening my words that clarity felt almost impolite. The judge reviewed the documentation in silence. Pages turned. Pens moved. Time passed without commentary. When he spoke again, his tone was measured. The pattern established intent, he said. The access granted did not equal permission. The repeated nature of the withdrawals demonstrated awareness. He ordered the accounts frozen pending further investigation. He ordered immediate restitution $9,500 within 24 hours. He made note of the broader implications, the potential for civil liability if further misuse was discovered. My parents didn't react right away. It was as if the words hadn't found a place to land yet. My brother looked stunned, not angry, not defiant, just caught off balance like someone who had assumed the floor would hold and suddenly found it didn't. The hearing ended without ceremony. No gavel slam, no speeches. Just a quiet directive to file the next set of documents and leave. I stood when it was over. My legs felt steady, my breath even. As I walked out of the courtroom, I passed my parents in the hall. My mother's face was pale. My father stared straight ahead. No one reached for me. No one said my name. Outside, the air felt colder than it had that morning. Or maybe I was more aware of it. I didn't feel victorious. There was no surge of satisfaction, no sense of having won something. What I felt instead was a release. Subtle, incomplete, but real. For the first time, the truth hadn't needed my voice to survive. It had stood on its own. The consequences unfolded faster than I expected. Not in dramatic bursts, but in a series of quiet, irreversible adjustments that left little room for interpretation. Within hours of the hearing, the bank followed the court's order. Accounts were locked, transactions halted. Notifications went out to institutions I had never contacted directly, each one responding with the same restrained professionalism. The system did what it was designed to do once the facts were acknowledged. By the end of the day, the first message came through from my mother. Short, unsteady. "They're saying we have to pay it back immediately." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of why. Just the shock of encountering a boundary that didn't move. 24 hours is not a long time when you've built your life around access rather than ownership. The restitution $9,500 wasn't an impossible sum. But it required liquidity. It required choices. And for the first time, those choices didn't include me. I heard later that my parents had to sell things quickly, not carefully, not on their terms. Jewelry that had sat untouched for years. A second vehicle that suddenly became unnecessary. Items that had once signaled comfort now converted into urgency. My brother's collapse was quieter, but more immediate. One of his business partners reached out to me the next morning, not to ask questions, to inform me. The partnership was being dissolved. Ethical concerns, he said carefully. The phrasing was polite, but the meaning was clear. Trust, once disrupted, doesn't isolate itself to one area of life. I didn't share the news. I didn't forward the message. I didn't need to. The ripple had already moved beyond me. At work, I kept my routine unchanged. Meetings, deadlines, deliverables. No one asked how the hearing had gone. No one needed to. The quiet respect in the room shifted slightly, subtle but noticeable. Less concern, more recognition. It wasn't approval I felt. It was alignment. That evening, I walked home instead of taking a car. The city felt muted, streetlights humming, footsteps echoing against concrete. I noticed things I usually move past too quickly: the weight of my bag on my shoulder and the rhythm of my breathing, the way the air cooled as the sun disappeared. For the first time since this started, my phone stayed quiet. No demands, no accusations, no appeals framed as questions. Just space. I realized then how much noise had existed before, how constant the expectation had been, how often my attention had been pulled away from my own life to stabilize someone else's. The silence wasn't peaceful in a sentimental way. It was stark, empty, honest. Later that night, a local article went live. A brief piece, no names highlighted, just the outline of a case involving financial abuse within a family and the legal response that followed. It didn't cast me as anything. It didn't need to. The facts were enough. I didn't read the comments. I didn't track engagement. I closed the browser and let it be. There was one more message before midnight. From my brother, a single sentence. I didn't think it would go this far. I read it once, then again. The words felt less like an apology and more like a recalculation, an attempt to measure consequence after the fact. I didn't reply. What struck me most in the days that followed wasn't the fallout. It was the absence of negotiation. No one tried to bargain. No one offered to explain. No one suggested we talk it through. They had assumed access would always be available. And when it wasn't, there was nothing left to argue. I slept better that week. Not because everything was resolved, but because something fundamental had ended. The expectation that I would absorb the cost. The belief that family entitled anyone to my silence. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving. And in that pause, the structure they relied on collapsed under its own weight. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It settled in layers. In the weeks following the hearing, I learned pieces of what had happened to my family, the way you learn about distant weather, through second-hand updates filtered and incomplete. A house sale stalled, a loan application denied, invitations that stopped coming. Not because anyone announced a decision, but because the context had shifted. Reputation, I realized, doesn't disappear loudly. It thins. My parents withdrew from the routines that had once defined them. The country club dinners, the charity events, the small performances of comfort that relied on the assumption that nothing beneath the surface would be questioned. When that assumption breaks, the performance becomes exhausting. I didn't reach out. I didn't check in. I didn't ask for updates or explanations. Distance had become a form of honesty, and I didn't want to dilute it. Work moved forward in a way I hadn't anticipated. The local attention from the case, brief, restrained, factual, had circulated just enough to position me differently. Not as someone seeking validation, but as someone who had drawn a line and held it. Investors asked sharper questions. Conversations shifted from reassurance to planning. Within a quarter, our revenue climbed by more than 20%. Not because of sympathy, but because clarity tends to attract alignment. It felt strange to notice progress unfolding alongside loss, to feel momentum where there had once been tension. I reminded myself that these things weren't connected by cause, only timing. My family, meanwhile, receded. Photos stopped appearing online. Messages slowed, then ceased. My parents didn't call. Not to argue, not to apologize. Just silence settling where expectation had once lived. Then one evening, my brother reached out. His message was brief, measured. "I'm sorry," he wrote. "I didn't understand what I was doing. I read it carefully. Not for hidden meaning, but for intent." The words felt late. Not dishonest, just delayed beyond the moment where they could change anything. I didn't reply. There are apologies that repair, and there are apologies that arrive after the structure they depended on has already collapsed. This felt like the latter, an acknowledgement without a path forward. I noticed something then that surprised me. I didn't feel guilty. In the past, silence like this would have gnawed at me, prompted second-guessing, pushed me to re-enter conversations I knew would circle back into obligation. This time, the absence felt settled, decided. At night, I thought about how much effort I had once put into keeping everyone else comfortable, how often I had mistaken endurance for loyalty. The idea that love required absorption, that it was proven by how much you were willing to carry without complaint. I saw now how narrow that definition had been. A healthy structure doesn't collapse when one person steps back. It adjusts, it redistributes weight, it survives accountability. What we had wasn't that. By the end of the year, the distance between us had solidified into something permanent, not dramatic, not hostile, just real. We existed in parallel, no longer intersecting. I wasn't triumphant about it. I wasn't bitter either. I was quieter. There's a particular calm that comes when you stop anticipating demands. When your phone becomes a tool instead of a trigger. When your time feels owned again, not parceled out in advance. I began to notice how often I had been living slightly braced, as if waiting for something to tip. That tension dissolved slowly, like a muscle learning it no longer had to stay clenched. What remained was not freedom in the abstract sense. It was specificity. Control over small things, how I spent my evenings, who had access to my attention, where my energy went when no one was asking for it. My family didn't lose everything. They lost access. And without it, they had to face the shape of their own lives without the buffer I had provided. I didn't watch closely enough to know how that unfolded. I didn't need to. I had already turned toward something else. 2 years later, I stood on a stage at the Cleveland Convention Center and watched the room settle. The lights were softer than I expected, not theatrical. Just enough to bring faces into focus without making anyone feel exposed. Rows of chairs filled slowly, filled. Conversations tapered off. The low hum of anticipation replaced the noise. I waited, hands resting loosely at my sides, breathing in a way that felt unremarkable, and that I realized was the point. The product launch went as planned. Clean, measured, no surprises. Our company had tripled since the year before. Not through spectacle, but through steady execution. The kind that doesn't make headlines until it's too consistent to ignore. Afterward, people approached with questions, with congratulations, with the kind of curiosity that comes when something has matured past its fragile stage. I answered what needed answering, declined what didn't. The boundaries felt natural now, not rehearsed. I didn't think about my family while I was there, not consciously. There were no ghosts in the room, no imagined reactions playing in the corners of my mind. That absence was the most telling sign of change. When the event ended, I walked back to my hotel alone. The night air carried the faint smell of rain. The city felt open and different in a way that allowed space for thought without pressure. I thought about how far the distance had stretched, not in miles, but in expectation. We hadn't spoken since the messages stopped. No holidays. No updates passed along through intermediaries. No attempts to renegotiate terms that no longer existed. The separation hadn't been formalized by words. It didn't need to be. Silence had become a shared understanding. I had learned something uncomfortable in the process, something that took time to accept without turning into bitterness. Family doesn't grant automatic rights to your future. That idea runs against everything we're taught to absorb quietly. That loyalty means endurance. That love requires access. That being needed is the same as being valued. It took losing all of that to see how incomplete those lessons were. I hadn't punished anyone. I hadn't taken revenge. I had simply withdrawn permission where it had never been properly requested. That distinction mattered. In the space that followed, my life didn't become louder or more triumphant. It became simpler. My decisions carried less static. My energy moved toward creation instead of containment. I noticed how often I laughed without checking myself. How rarely I felt the need to explain my choices. I stopped measuring success by how little disruption I caused. There's a quiet strength in reclaiming authorship. Not by rewriting the past, but by refusing to let it dictate the future. By recognizing where responsibility ends and ownership begins. I thought about the man I had been before all of this, the one who believed silence kept the peace, who confused stability with fairness, who assumed that if he stayed useful enough, he would eventually be seen. I don't judge him now. He did what he knew how to do with the information he had. But I don't live that way anymore. I have relationships now that don't rely on imbalance to function. Work that doesn't demand self-erasure. A sense of direction that doesn't bend under the weight of other people's expectations. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer mistake permission for love. The night ended without ceremony. I returned to my room, set my bag down, and stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the city. Lights scattered, traffic moving, lives intersecting without entanglement. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I had already stepped into it. For a long time, I thought survival meant endurance, keeping things steady, absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to feel it. I believed that if I stayed quiet enough, useful enough, the balance would eventually correct itself. It doesn't work that way. What I learned slowly, and not without cost, is that boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are acts of clarity, or acts of, they tell you where you end, and where someone else begins. Without them, even love can turn into something that consumes instead of supports. I didn't lose my family all at once. I lost an illusion. The belief that access equals care. That being needed is the same as being valued. Letting go of that was painful, but it also made room for something more honest to take its place. If you're listening to this and something feels familiar, if you've ever carried more than your share just to keep the peace, you're not alone. And you're not wrong for wanting something different. If this story resonates with you, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment and share your experience. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if you found something meaningful here, a quiet like or subscribe truly helps. Thank you for staying with me until the end.